for that introduction, and thank everybody for coming on this extremely cold day. It's much appreciated that you all made this effort. I've actually read Lynn's book twice, and without any fraternal bias whatsoever, I can say that I do recommend it. It's a very good book. In fact, I read it frontways and backwards. I read it forwards and backwards. So. Because it also reads very well if you start at the end and sort of work your way backwards. That's just by the by. I think, Lynn, you make a number of interesting, you tell a story, a very important story, and you make a number of claims. And what I'd be interested to do in the course of this conversation is just to maybe interrogate, it's slightly strong a word, but interrogate you about some of these claims. But maybe just to begin with, if you could maybe on a more personal note, because you've been interested in this subject ever since I can remember, actually, and my history with you goes back a very long way. But you have always been interested in this subject. You've been interested in politics, and you've been interested in specifically this issue, and I think you've made this issue your own. And I just wanted to, my first question really is for you to first of all explain why you are so interested in this subject, why you think it has been so neglected, and what are your personal reasons for getting so involved?
Well, thanks, Alan. This is a family affair. As you know, Alan is my brother, my baby brother. My big brother's here too, Danny, and my mother. And all of you are sort of extended family in a way. I know many of you, most of you actually. So it's really lovely to be here amongst family and friends. I'd like to thank Rabbi Elia for his kind words. I think I have learnt more from him and from others than he could possibly learn from me and my book. Having said that, to your question, Alan, well, as you know, I think we are quite a political family. I think ever since I can remember, we've had discussions about politics. I know my brother Danny's also very into politics. And I think that's because politics had an impact on our family. I mean, Mum and Dad were both refugees from Iraq. They came to this country in 1950, and they had to establish themselves. And we were first generation Brits, I suppose. But I remember when I was a teenager, two things really. One was the terrible hangings in January 1969 of 9 Jews who were executed in Liberation Square in Baghdad. And I remember going to this big demonstration outside the Iraqi embassy. And it really had an effect on me. And I remember you said you were there too, even though you must have been no more than about 9.
I remember it, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously the whole family was sort of galvanized by this experience. And I think the late 60s, early 70s were a very political time. You know, we went on demonstrations for Syrian Jews, we went on demonstrations for Russian Jews, and then we had our family from Baghdad arrived. You know, we had 2 grandparents, my Aunt Marcel, her son is here. David, where are you? And we had cousins who landed on us, who also escaped illegally from Baghdad, and they were on their way to Canada. Suddenly, these cousins that we never knew arrived out of nowhere. So, you know, we were very much involved with what was happening in the Middle East. And I suppose that's where my interest sort of first arose.
Can you tell us a little bit about the organisation you founded, Harif, and the blog point of no return that you.
Well, Harif was founded, I co-founded it actually with Lionel Salama, who some of you may know. He's a member of the synagogue. It was founded in 2005, and it's a very small organisation of volunteers. Actually, there's me, there's Lawrence, there's Michelle, who's the creative director. Where is she? There she is. And there's Ralph, who's a gentleman from Morocco. And we organise talks, we organise films, discussions, and the aim of that organisation is really to raise the awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And we chose that description quite deliberately. We're not just Jews from Arab countries, we're not Arab Jews. That's because the Jews came before the Arabs, so we're not Arab Jews, but we are Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And this organisation has been going for some time. But in association with Harif, I've been running a blog, which some of you may or may not know. It's called Point of No Return. And I've been collecting information, basically published information, articles in the press. I've done a few original articles myself. But over time, certain sort of themes seem to sort of suggest themselves. And so I thought that perhaps I should put things that I've learnt in a book, which I've done.
If we turn to your book, I guess the first claim you make, and perhaps this is a good place to start, is that the Jews were effectively ethnically cleansed from the Middle East, which is quite a strong term. So what is your basis? I mean, I think you use the term a Jewish Nakba. Is that your invention?
No, absolutely not. A lot of people don't like that term, actually. But I find it's a useful shorthand to describe what actually happened to the Jews. Ethnic cleansing is a term that actually is quite recent. I think it arose in the 1990s to describe what was happening in the former Yugoslavia. But I think it's not a claim I make. I think I describe a fact, and that is the catastrophic decline, dramatic decline of the Jewish population in Arab countries, which went from 1 million in 1948 to about 4,500 today. And it's not my claim. Historians have used that term. Someone called Nathan Weinstock used it, and he said it was actually a more dramatic decline than even what happened in the 30s in Nazi Germany to the Jews. So before, the extermination got underway. So
can we interject on this point?
Yes, why not?
The word Nakba is an Arabic word,
Yeah.
which means uprising. And it should not
catastrophe.
be
Catastrophe. Yeah.
It's only was described for the Arabs,
Yeah.
not for Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clarify on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the Palestinians use that word. They describe their Nakba.
Yeah.
But I use it because it's a sort of shorthand. People immediately understand what you mean by that, But it is controversial because it is an Arabic word.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't like it.
Yeah.
But would it be? Is it reasonable to describe it as a catastrophe? Because the ultimate fate of so many of the Jews from Arab countries, I mean, they weren't massacred. I mean, there were some massacres. There was the Farhud in Iraq and so on. But in general terms. Most of them got on with their lives and they've made new lives for themselves in Israel. So does that not put some immediate doubt as to whether the term Nakba or catastrophe is an appropriate one?
I think you have a point there. And I think if you asked refugees or ex-refugees today whether they have any regrets about having been uprooted, I think they would say absolutely not. What happened to us was actually the best thing because because they have been able to rebuild their lives and move to countries where there's freedom, there's democracy, there's civil rights. I mean, who wouldn't want to move somewhere like that? But having said that, the manner of their uprooting was forced. And that's why I use the word Nakba, because it was a forced uprooting. It was against their will. And that's the reason.
Yeah, and of course the Jews have been settled communities in the Middle East from going back a very, very long way, and it was their home, and they felt quite integrated into Arab culture, and generally speaking, certainly during the colonial era, relations were quite good between the Jews and their neighbours. And so what happened to them was indeed traumatic in the sense that they had their property taken from them, and well, you can please describe the different ways in which they were oppressed during this time.
Well, first I'd just correct you, Alan, by saying you said they were integrated into Arab culture. I would make the point that because the Jews had been there for such a long time in the Middle East and North Africa, before the Arabs, 1,000 years before Islam, they contributed to that culture from the very beginning. And in a way, it's the Arabs who slotted in. But of course, with Arabic taking over as the main language, and, in the end, there was a synthesis of culture. And because the Jews were a minority, they did integrate into the majority culture. But the way the uprooting took place was really in two ways. One was very dramatic. You had communities in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, for instance, came to an end more or less within a very short time, and there were airlifts from these countries. But in North Africa, for instance, it was a slower process. It had to do with decolonization as well, because North Africa, well, the French North Africa was still under French control until the mid-50s or even early 60s in the case of Algeria. So I would describe what happened to those. Algeria was also a place actually where the Jews had a dramatic exit in 1962 when Algeria declared independence. But in Morocco and Tunisia, the Jews had what was described as being ushered towards the exit. In other words, it happened in quite a gradual way. And also in Morocco, for instance, there wasn't the degree of state-sanctioned persecution that you got in Iraq, for instance. So there was a difference from country to country, but 90% of the Jews did leave within 10 years of 1948.
There's a very memorable little vignette that you describe in your book, which is, I think it's the chapter, My House is Your House. and you describe how a member of one of the wealthy families in Egypt, the Castro family, happened to be listening to the wife of Sadat
Yeah.
giving a talk. And she went up to, what's her name?
Mrs. Sadat.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Jihan,
that's
yeah,
right,
Jihan Sadat, after the talk, and made conversation with her, and she said she came from Egypt, and Mrs. Sadat gave the traditional Arabic greeting, Beti Betek, my house is your house, little understanding the irony that her house actually was her. The Sadats had actually taken over the house of the Castro, or had expropriated it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I forgot to mention that, of course, the Exodus happened not just suddenly, but these Jews had to leave with nothing, or very little, or one suitcase, or 50 dinars, or whatever it was, 20 dinars. So the dispossession was extremely painful, obviously, because they had to start in their new countries with nothing. And of course, in the case of those who went to Israel, they ended up being housed in tent camps. In the 50s, the conditions were terrible in Israel. There was rationing, there wasn't enough food. These tents, some of them remained for a decade or more, and they gradually turned into permanent towns. For instance, Sderot started out as a tent camp.
Would it be fair to say that, as far as the Arabs are concerned, the formation of the State of Israel was a huge provocation, and of course, the Jews, as a minority in Muslim-dominated countries, did not deserve collective punishment. But would you not say that was the catalyst behind the Jewish exodus? And had it not been the case that Israel had got founded at that time, the Jews might have continued to live. They had very few sort of political ambitions. They just wanted to be left alone, really, as communities, running their own affairs. What would you say about the fact that Israel may have been the catalyst for what happened?
Well, I certainly would argue against that. I think it's clear that anti-Semitism was not invented in 1948 in the Middle East. And if you go back far enough, you will find plenty of pogroms and massacres in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm thinking of, you can go back to 1066 when 3,000 Jews were murdered in Granada, in Muslim Spain. But fast forwarding to the 20th century, there were certainly plenty of massacres in Morocco, which actually not many people know about, because Morocco has this carefully crafted image of coexistence, if you like. But in fact, it has the worst record of pogroms against its Jewish population. But apart from massacres, I think there was another factor, which is that we haven't spoken about the dhimmi status of Jews in Islam, and that was a second-class status, which basically gave Jews very little rights. They were considered inferiors, and they had to pay a special tax, and in return, the ruler would protect them. And you may well ask yourself, well, why would these Jews need protecting? And very often the population as a whole was actually quite hostile. I mean, thinking of Morocco again, where the Jews were the only non-Muslim minority because the Christians had died out, because the Christians had been forcibly converted to Islam, or they'd just been killed. So the Moroccan population was sort of pretty hostile to the Jewish minority, and the Jews were actually put into ghettos, which were locked at night. There were gates on the Jewish quarters, something which actually didn't happen to that extent in Egypt, for instance, or Iraq. I think there was a Jewish quarter in Iraq, in Baghdad, but the gates were not locked, as far as I know.
But just taking issue with your use of the term anti-Semitism to describe the treatment of the Jews in Muslim lands before, because I think anti-Semitism, first of all, it was a European invention. It was a term that was only coined in 1880, and in a way, it's not an appropriate term to use for the Jew status in Muslim lands. Certainly, they were regarded as inferior, but they did have a status. It was a recognised status, and as people of the book, there was a certain respect for the fact that they were a religious minority who they may have failed to recognise the true religion, but nevertheless they were treated differently from say pagan communities, and they were allowed to govern themselves, with their own communities, and so at least it may not be equal status, but there was a status, and in general it was a status that was respected, and in certain countries like, certainly in the Ottoman Empire, and wherever there was mixed population, wherever there were Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together, on the whole, they fared better than they did in Christian Europe.
Well, I think that is a controversial assertion.
Another controversy.
I'll tell you why. Because you're right that Jews could have had respected status, and in fact, history tells us there were prosperous merchants, there were advisors to the Sultan. Someone like Maimonides, who was the doctor to Saladin, obviously had a respected status, and there was no shortage of Jews who used their skills and their talents to sort of for the betterment of the regime, if you like, or the country where they were living. But having said that, you had the whole gamut of treatment. You had treatment that varied from ruler to ruler, from country to country. You had these very prosperous Jews, but you also had Jews who were slaves. Like, for instance, in the Berber country or in parts of Kurdistan, the Jews were sort of no better than the property of the tribal rulers, the tribal leaders. So in that respect, I would say that their status was as bad or even worse than Jews in Christian lands. But I think the one thing you can say is that they were always living in a state of precarious insecurity. So, I mean, you could have a good ruler who treated Jews well, and then the next minute the ruler would change and their situation would change. So, yeah.
So, can I ask?
Yeah.
You're in chapter 6, you put in what came first, Zionism
Yeah,
or
yeah.
anti-Semitism?
We touched
So
on
the
that.
obvious answer is anti-Semitism was historical thing.
Yeah,
Since medieval time, there was anti-Semitism, correct?
yeah.
So what does this chapter elaborate more than this?
You have to read
Obvious,
it.
obvious answer. Well, the answer is very obvious.
Well, yeah, I think Lucia.
I'd like to differ
Yeah.
a little from your analysis.
Yeah.
The Jews are not particularly special. I mean, these are hard times. Do you think the others did well? They didn't. Everyone lived in poverty at the whim of their rapacious rulers, the Christians, all the rest of them. But on the whole, I think that for 1400 years, Jews lived under the rule of Islam far more comfortably than the Western world. They had the rights guaranteed by Islamic law, by the Quran itself, not always upheld, of course not. Of course there were pogroms, of course there were riots, but everyone suffered in those days. And I think it's perhaps a little, how can I put it, a little unfair perhaps to single out the Jews as being subject to particular anti-Semitism and discrimination. In fact, in the Ottoman Empire, it was the Christians who always attacked the Jews, and the Turks who protected them time and time again from Christians.
Sorry, and also just to second Lucian's point there wasn't the same theological odium directed against the Jews. I mean, there was no suggestion of deicide or and there was no wholesale expulsion, as you saw from England in the 13th century or from parts of Europe, or noticeably from Spain. That was a traumatic experience which the Jews suffered under Christianity, which they didn't suffer under Islam.
Well, I would agree with you, and Lucien is a very eminent historian who's written lots of books on this subject. So I really hesitate to disagree with him. Having said that, yes, everything you say is true. What you say is true too, but I would say there is a difference. The Christians eventually had the protection of the Christian powers, and the Christian powers, the Western powers, put pressure on the Ottoman Empire to emancipate the Christians. So the Christians did have the power of the West behind them in the end. The Jews had no one. And that's why from the 18th century onwards you have examples of Jews who've tried to escape the Arab world precisely because they wanted more security and they wanted more rights. So you had, I think your own family, Lucien, became British subjects, is that right? Right, when in the 18th century? Okay, so they're always trying to escape their dhimmi status. And what happened was actually quite miraculous, because in the 19th century, a group of French Jews decided that the lot of the Jews was so bad in the Arab countries that they decided to set up the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a network of schools. The idea behind it was, well, Lucien is the expert again. The idea behind it was that the Jews would be educated. They would be educated and they would be able to better themselves and therefore demand their rights and actually deserve their rights. And this was a revolutionary development in amongst Jewish communities, and I know many of our parents attended the Alliance school, And what happened was it led to the development of a Jewish middle class that then reversed the whole dhimmi status. In other words, the Arabs saw this class of educated Jews emerge that were actually getting all the best jobs. They were the backbone of the colonial administration when the British and the French mandates, the protectorates were established. And this created a sort of terrible resentment, from the Arabs, because these Jews, they were no longer inferior dhimmis. They were actually doing much better than the Arabs were. And I think this is actually an element in which explains I use the word anti-Semitism. Okay, you're being a purist about it. But okay, one could say anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Jewish hostility. I just use anti-Semitism because it's easier. So I would say that resentment of the Jewish community was quite a key element, especially in French North Africa. And that explains another reason why the Jews were expelled when these countries became independent.
Lynn, can I interject there? When Lynn was writing the book, we had lots of discussion on this. And the point I said that compared with the Jews of Europe, you were much better treated. And the point she was trying to make is that they were second-class citizens. They did not have the full rights. And I think in the last chapter of the book, she talks about all the indigenous peoples within the Arab world and the way they get treated. And going back to one point which Lucian made, look what the Turks did to the Armenians, who were Christian.
Actually,
and that was, 150 years ago?
Yeah, and I think you do need to see the treatment of the Jews in the context of the treatment of all minorities.
Indeed.
In the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
That is, if I can just say a few words about this, I think it's not just about anti-Semitism, but it's about the treatment of the other minorities and the inability of the Muslim and the Arab to deal with minorities in a fair way.
Yeah.
And
that's right, and that is exactly the conclusion of my book, so you don't need to read it. Buy it, but don't read it.
How much importance can be attributed to the formation of the State of Israel and the after effects of the conflict between the Arabs and Israel in the expulsion and the exodus of the Jews from the Arab lands? And I suppose a hypothetical would be, if Israel hadn't been formed, would those communities still be in those countries today?
Well, I would say they would not be in those communities. You just have to look at the way the Christians have been treated and the Yazidis, and they have no Israel of their own. So this points to a fundamental problem, which Allah really mentioned, which is that there's an inability to tolerate difference. There's an inability to tolerate difference amongst Muslims too. I mean, not just non-Muslims. And I think the Arab-Israel conflict is a symptom of this inability. So it's not a reaction. It's actually the cause of the whole rejection of Zionism, the rejection of the establishment of Israel. And this is the conflict that we're still grappling with today. But people see Israel as the cause of this problem, whereas it's not. I would say that the inability to tolerate difference preceded the establishment of Israel by several decades and can be attributed to extremists who took over, I think, control of the Arab world, and we can talk about that as well, if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that it's very important to understand how the legacy of Europe, because Europe emerged as a power in the Middle East for a relatively short period of time. because the decolonization process started
Yeah.
before European ideas and political values sort of got properly established amongst the indigenous populations. So I suppose the question is, nationalism swept the Arab world in the 20th century, but nationalism was the order of the day.
Yeah.
And Zionism was no different. It was a nationalism that just happened to be Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But the principle of self-governance and self-realization through the nation, this was something that actually, Sephardi Jews did not have any particular, they were quite indifferent they were not politically engaged.
No.
And they were quite indifferent to Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And but it was the order of the day. It
Yeah.
was something encouraged by the great powers after the First World War. Colonial administrations were supposed to dismantle themselves, and one could make the argument, and this is a question for you, that if they hadn't dismantled those empires, if they had maintained their colonial rule, because quite clearly the Arab nations were not ready to take on independence in the fully fledged Western sense of giving rights to their people and rights of citizenship and the rule of law and free press and all these things that we take for granted in the West as constituting good governance. Now that had never taken root. So, you answer that.
Well, of course I'm afraid it's a fantasy, Alan, because obviously it didn't happen that way. But I would claim that, how would you explain then that some of the worst massacres occurred under colonial rule? For instance, in 1945 in Libya, when the British were still in control, 145 Jews were killed. Was it 130? And the same, and there were riots in 1945 in Egypt, which had been unheard of in the 20th century. And this was before Israel, all right? Also, the Farhud occurred, admittedly Iraq was independent. Iraq was already independent, but it occurred while the British were on the doorstep of the gates of Iraq. Yeah, another example, thank you, Lawrence. Another example, Aden was under British rule in 1947, and 87 Jews were killed then in a pogrom. So I'm afraid your thesis just unraveled.
Well, can I, now that I'm being interviewed, I can answer that question, I think, by invoking the great Professor Kaduri, who well understood the mentality of appeasement. He called it the Chatham House version, that sort of ingrained itself in the British political classes, where they were in a headlong rush to abdicate their responsibilities towards those countries that they were responsible for. And so, for example, you give the example of the Farhud. It's a well-known fact that under General Wavell, the army was encamped outside of Baghdad.
Exactly. And
the reason was because the General Wavell, together with Cornwallis, who was the ambassador in Baghdad at the time, were worried that even though there had been a pro-Nazi coup and Rashid Ali was ostensibly running the place, they didn't want to. They were worried about the public opinion. I mean, not that
they wanted to appear neutral.
They wanted to appear neutral, and they didn't want it to be seen that the British, by British force of arms, the regent was going to be re-established in Baghdad.
Yeah.
So all those things, all those incidents that you mentioned, I mean, they were all very much in a post-imperial era, when, I mean, the French took a slightly different view because...
No, they didn't actually.
Well, until much later. But I mean, I mean, the British were, at that stage, really negligent in allowing these massacres to take place in Aden and Iraq and elsewhere.
But actually, the French were equally guilty. In 1934, there was a massacre in Constantine in Algeria. They were also dilatory in dealing with the massacre in Morocco in 1948. So this was under French colonial rule. The forces of law and order in Morocco took 3 hours to arrive. By then, 48 Jews had died. So maybe it was a kind of characteristic of these imperial powers, these colonial powers, that they just didn't want to interfere when Jews were being killed. But I would say it wasn't just them. I mean, you had the Egyptians were obviously independent in 1948. There were riots in the Jewish quarter in Cairo, and the Egyptians did not intervene to stop that either. So I would say that when it just goes to prove that the Jews were a defenseless minority, no matter who was in charge.
And can I just say something about a bit more than the inception of Israel and the domination of the Western power in there? Whereas the element that referred by Dr. Esther Webman, Hebrew University, and she tracked that back to actually the war that Prophet Muhammad and the slaughter of the Jewish tribe in Saudi Arabia at that time. So there is some religious element there as well.
Well, can I just say a bit more about that? Because I think we come to a very important element in Muslim and Arab anti-Semitism, and that is the influence of the Mufti. And the Mufti, I would say, more than anyone else, was responsible for inciting anti-Jewish hatred in the early 20s and 30s.
By a religious.
And what it was a combination of traditional Quranic prejudice, if you like, you know, the anti-Jewish verses in the Quran, mixed with a new element which was imported from Europe and which was actually Nazi anti-Semitism. So by that I mean, you know, theories of Jewish power, conspiracies to dominate the world, things which we hear about still today, which are very prevalent in the Arab world. So basically he concocted this new anti-Semitism and he gave it a kind of Muslim seal of approval, if you like. And I would say that he, more than anyone else, did more to destabilize the position of Jews in the Arab world, not just in Palestine. You know, people know that he incited riots in Hebron, in Jerusalem in 1920, 1929, but in fact, when you look at the history, he was inciting against the Jews of Yemen, he was inciting against the Jews of Baghdad, as you know, in 1941, and in fact played a very big part in causing the Farhud. And I would argue that this sort of anti-Semitism is still with us today. Yeah, and there's another element which I talk about in the book, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was established in 1928 as a reaction against modernity, against colonialism. But what people don't really realize is that anti-Semitism was at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy. And the Muslim Brotherhood, the Mufti became the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1948. So there's this, you know, this sort of complicity between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Mufti, And again, the Muslim Brotherhood is with us today. And Islamic State, the leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, we don't know if he's alive or dead, he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm getting prompted. And this is something that's underrated or understated, you know, the anti-Semitic nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sorry. Put me off.
So, just maybe before, just one more question really before I'll invite the members of the audience to ask questions. I suppose you have mentioned in the book and in the Blood that you consider that this story and a good understanding of what happened to the Jews from Arab countries is a very important element in a potential peace or reconciliation. Can you just explain how you reached that conclusion?
Right. Well, I mean, to talk about peace at the moment seems like pie in the sky, doesn't it? Especially after Abbas's latest outpourings. But assuming the Palestinians do come to the table and we do talk peace, their bottom line is the right of return. And if their bottom line is the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to Israel proper, that means that the antidote to the right of return is the issue of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. And I think we need to compare the two sets of refugees. If they demand a right of return, we demand a right not to return, right? You can't have a right of return if we can't have a right not to return, right? So there needs to be a recognition of the exchange of populations. And I hope that would bring about a kind of understanding and eventual reconciliation between the two sides. I mean, it's a terrible oversimplification, but that's basically it.
The right not to return.
Yeah. Why would we want to return?
You're welcome to return.
Welcome.
Now they're welcoming you.